So, welcome to Crossing Borders. Really delighted to welcome Miranda Pennell and Massimiliano Mollona. Miranda contributed to our very first series of Crossing Borders, talking about and showing her own work. And then she was last year in the building as part of the What If Festival with a piece of work and also a really interesting talk. And at that point, I'd been really curious about Miranda's explorations into anthropology. And so we talked at that point and thought it would be really great to try and bring that conversation into the building. So thank you for coming and thank you for sharing your conversation with us. Thanks.
So the plan for the evening is that we're going to have a conversation about and sort of try to find parallels which we think are easy to find between these different disciplines, different practices and different ways of thinking about and processing human experience, which are dance, anthropology and film, which are things that we've both worked. Well, actually, we work with dance. Well, it's things that we're thinking about anyway. And we're going to show we've got some extracts of films to talk about, and I think I'm going to introduce myself a bit first and talk about me, and then hand over to Mao, and then hopefully it'll be conversational. We talked about having this conversation. Tell me if I'm not being loud enough. I've actually, at the last minute, wrote a script. And then I thought, what am I doing? This is a conversation and I'm writing a script. And that's because I'm frightened of performances. And I know this should be a performance, should be a conversation. And I think the idea of the conversation is that we pretend that it isn't a performance and that, but we know it's an artifice. But I have to keep in my mind also that it needs to be shaped as a performance. So you have to keep. I'm hoping that I'm going to be somehow taken into the trance of performance, and at the same time, another part of my mind bear in mind that this is a performance that needs to be shaped, and keep those two things as we're going along. And I think the idea of creating the idea of this artifice is to provoke something to happen, and to provoke something that's interesting to happen, and that's something that's going to be we're going to be part of the conversation about choreography and anthropology and film. So just to say a bit about myself, I trained as a choreographer and dancer, and I started using film quite early on, partly to sort of get round the intense subjectivity and experiential quality of the dance training that I had, which possibly it was the particular nature of my own training, but I felt quite at sea and I didn't really have an evaluative framework for thinking about what I was doing. And it was such an intense experience being a dancer that I found it quite hard to actually create a frame for showing, for framing my experience or what I wanted to show, which is why I started working with film. And I think what film did for me, or what it offered, obviously I started looking, it led to me being able to think about movement in the world around me, in the real world. And so it was a sort of reverse process, rather than going out into the world and spotting movements and then bringing them into the studio where I could abstract them, take them out of their context and represent them. I was going back out into the world and thinking about looking for dance, looking for choreography, looking for performance, and trying to find out what it meant for me. And of course, part of what I found working with film is that in some ways you're putting things back into the context where they start from in terms of filming people in the world doing things. But also, you're selectively framing things, so you're selectively leaving out information and selectively choosing when to show the context and when to confuse the audience by removing the context. And I think that's something that dance plays with, that ambiguity quite a lot, of making you wonder about what movement conventions are for and where do they come from. Certainly if you're working with familiar performances in everyday life, things that we might see, whether it's a football match or soldiers marching, sometimes you want to defamiliarize that, so that the way by taking away some of the context, it also helps you to think about where did these things that I'm familiar with, where did they come from, and why are they as they are, and what are they for? So I think that's certainly that's part of what I think about filming movement and filming things in the world. And I think ultimately that was quite important for me to connect what I was doing in the studio, find a way of how that related to the rest of my experience, the rest of the time when I'm working, when I'm living in the world. And also it meant that I was thinking in trying to redefine or find out what dance meant or what performance meant for me. It meant I was really needed to think beyond the contemporary dance idiom which I was trained in, and you know my particular education wasn't even wasn't at all historically based, even the historical tradition that led to the evolution of the techniques that I was trained with, I didn't really have a sense of where they came or why they came or what their meaning was. So that's and I think, if I go on a bit more, can I continue?
Yes, you go.
Okay. So what I wanted to say, that the idea was thinking about the idea of film as can be a provocation, and that the presence of the camera, it makes things happen, and it's also a construction. When you put a film together and when you make all of the choices that you're making, you're always selecting of what you think's important and what you think is not important, what you show and what you hide. So, and the camera is always, and the camera film, it's always a player in some way in what you're constructing. And I think I've then gone on recently. I went to study, I did a master's at Goldsmiths in visual anthropology. And so I can't really speak as an anthropologist. I'm not an anthropologist, but I found it really, really interesting. So I'm just going to quickly weave this in. Because what I thought about was the three things that really interested me was the idea of anthropologists were talking a lot about cross-cultural encounters. And I thought, in terms of film, that was very interesting because the negotiation of an encounter is something you're always doing as a filmmaker. As soon as you have a camera in your hand, you are an outsider. And I am always making films within what I would call my own society here in England. But I'm always an outsider, and I've made certain films in different institutions, so I'm always an outsider. And I go like a tourist to visit a particular culture, a world. Maybe it's a music school, maybe it's the army. And I start off as a tourist, and I try as quickly as possible to learn the language that they're speaking, partly to gain their respect and their trust. I learn the language, and also to gain an understanding. And I thought, well, that process is very similar, or it's an interesting thing to think about the dynamics of that, and the power that you have with the camera, because you're provoking things to happen, but there's lots of issues around that and how you use that. And I think that also working through anthropology helped me to think allegorically about what I was doing in my own process, and think about the anthropology of what I'm doing. And I was just going to say one thing. Mao's going to talk about Jean Rouch, and we're going to look at some of that work. And just one of the things that really, there's lots of things that are very interesting about Jean Rouch, which one of the things rather nice is he talked about, he was working in Niger and on the Gold Coast, filming possession rituals. And he worked on this for years and years and years and lived there. And one other thing he talked about was going to film a particular possession ritual and waiting for days for these people to go into trance, and it just wasn't happening. They just couldn't get it. It wasn't happening. They used drumming to invoke, bring on the trance. It just wasn't happening. So he just, after a couple of days, he just thought, sod it, I'm going to start filming. And then as he started filming, sure enough, people started going into a trance. And afterwards, he said, on reflection, he felt sure that his camera was provoking the trance to happen. So it was a shift from the old technology wasn't working, which was the drums, and the new thing was. And he had lots of other things to say about trance and filmmaking, and which we can talk about. On that note, I'm just going to show this film, which is just a few minutes. It's 3.5 minutes long. So what I was going to say, I mean, there's different ways in which I've talked about this film. Just to link it with what I've just been talking about, I think that the camera provokes a choreography, in that there are some rules, and the movement of the camera is provoking movement from the dancers, and that the choreography, which is a set of rules or principles which they're all following, is provoking in turn a performance, what I call a performance, which consists of lots of micro negotiations between the people. They're negotiating subtly between each other. They don't know each other that well, as a sort of element of politeness, and they're negotiating their camera and how they present themselves to the camera. And I think that's what we're witnessing that through the faces that we're seeing. I also think in this film also has the feeling of a performance, because it's shot in a single take. There's no editing, so you're aware of the unfolding of a process of the film being made certainly more than in the other films that I've made. You can feel that the real-time unfolding of the relationship between the camera and the performers. What else? I think that film anyway yields to our desire and our curiosity of looking at other people, and we have that in performance as well, but it's more embarrassing in performance. It's more it's a confrontation that you have to deal with. I mean, film, they kind of pin you to your seat, I think, the looks, but still you have a permission to watch freely somehow. And also the nature of these people their performance, they seem to be inviting the looks. They're inviting you to look, in that they're sort of shifting around so that you can see them all. They're arranging themselves so that they can better see you and that you can better see them. And I think after this was shot, I was very pleased with the feeling that the experience of the viewer in this particular film, I really felt that the experience of the viewer out there is built into the film somehow. It's woven in, and it sort of completes the relationship somehow. I think that's possibly. Oh, sorry. Oh, well, it was You Made Me Love You, and it's 2005. I could go on and on, but I think it might be.
Yeah, if you want to put this in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll play the part of the anthropologist, and anthropology, just very briefly, it's something that maybe you're not familiar with, but anthropologists generally go around and study other cultures. And what we do, we follow the method of participant observation, which was an old-fashioned method that was set up in the 1920s by Malinowski, the father of anthropology. And we basically take part of the daily activities of people. We work in fields or factories, we perform religious ritual, we get involved in local politics, we spend time in leisure. And so basically that at least for 1 year, 1.5 years, we kind of get lost in this kind of other cultures. And the first thing that we notice when we get into the field is how different actually daily activities look like. Literally, it's difficult to understand what people are doing. It's difficult to give a meaning to people's action. Are people working or playing? Are they fighting or kind of staging some kind of ritual of confrontation? And so it's very difficult to actually realize that human actions have a meaning only when they are put in context. Maybe unlike animal actions that are kind of universally understandable. And so what we do is really try to put in context action that normally, that at the beginning we don't understand. For instance, I've been working a lot in Brazil and in north of England on 2 different topics. In Brazil, I've been looking at violence, unsurprisingly, and I've been living in a favela in this steel town that was built in the middle of a tropical valley in the 1930s by a dictator. And when I first arrived in this favela, I was really amazed by the level of violence that was played out by children. But then slowly I understood that actually that was not violence, that was their way of communicating. That violence was so ingrained in that place that to me these actions were really kind of, I was overemphasizing the meaning of this action. So slowly, for me, to be in the field meant to put this action in context. And similarly, my research in England, I was looking at work, and especially the kind of the work performed by a community, a working class community that was being displaced by the kind of Thatcher, sort of the industrialization measures. And so I got involved in this kind of working class community and started to work in 2 factories. And one of the first thing that I noticed working as an assistant at the furnace was this kind of theatrical nature of this workspace, where the smelters were this incredible performance that were kind of dancing in front of the furnace. There was this audience of laborers and skilled laborers. There was this big screen where the light of the furnace was projected. And for me, learning to work was really learning a performance, was learning to perform. And only later I gave economic meaning to what I was doing. Only later I realized that actually my actions were somehow useful or economical. So I think that the interesting thing about anthropology is that you have to actually develop some kind of choreographic sensitivity to understand people's action and the relationship between the action and the context. And I think that in a way, anthropologists are really performers, because once we get into the field, we open up a sort of choreographic space where the distinction between the observer and the kind of performer, between who's observed and who is actually kind of studying, between the individual and the collective, all these kind of distances are kind of differences are kind of blurred. And so I think that not only anthropology has to develop a kind of choreographic sensitivity, but also I think that anthropologists and choreographers have similar kind of interest, especially in the relationship between the imaginary and the kind of practical world that surrounds us, in the origin of movement, the consequences of action, the possibility of cooperation, of finding out sort of community of practices. And in fact, there are many performers that I really like. They really look at kind of forms of self-organization, of sort of open ways of communicating through material practices, but also through sensuous communication. And in fact, I really like these kind of performances that kind of question this relationship between action and context. And tap into this kind of idea of human action, how they can be restaged, rescripted. There is, for instance, one Yvonne Rainer that I really like, because she looks really at this kind of relationship between work and leisure and alienation, the possibility of cooperation between people. And I think that, for instance, The Mind is a Muscle is a great anthropological studies of the possibility of human movements. The idea that she restaged this kind of work-like movements, these kind of found gestures in the context of a minimalist Anderson theatre is a great way of questioning our own perception of leisure, of work, of alienation. And it's very powerfully politically, and I think that was really what intrigued me about the possibility of performance. For instance, by kind of performing work in an art context, she really questioned the distinction between aesthetic and economics. By also this idea of showing that work can be pleasant to perform and to be observed, also she breaks the distinction between work and leisure. And also the idea of using non-specialist dancers, non-alienated workers, is really interesting because you can actually understand that these performers were more interested in the possibility of cooperation than in the economy of their individual actions. So for me, Yvonne Rainer was a really interesting way of looking at performance as anthropology, as this kind of critical reflection about human agency, and also the possibility of cooperation. Yvonne Rainer has this really interesting part in which she's against, in her manifesto, she's against this kind of transformation, against the magic, the glamour of the spectacle. She's really, I think, very engaged in finding new possibility of cooperation, reciprocity, open structure in a place, in a work in general. And more generally, I've been also attracted by the work of performance artists. More recently, Martha Rosler, Backyard Economy is another work that kind of deconstructs the whole idea of work and performance in the context of a feminist critique of a kind of household economy. And also, I think I really, to me, is really impressive the work of Francis Alice, the Belgian performance artist, because I think he's both a performer and an anthropologist. He kind of sets up small rules of choreography and try to show the human action have a meaning that is determined by the kind of interaction between the audience and the performers. One of the examples is his work called A Story of Deception, where he goes into a gun shop in Mexico, he buys a gun and goes into the street and he walks with a gun in his hands and nobody stops him, nobody seems to notice. And it's interesting because to me that says that basically in a context like Mexico City, people have learned to cohabit with violence peacefully. And, had he been performing the same thing in London, probably someone would have tried to stop him and some kind of violence would have erupted. So this kind of paradoxical relationship between actions and the context, I think that both performers and anthropologists are interested in. And in particular, after that I was doing fieldwork, I've been working on film because, as Miranda was saying, what I think is that when anthropologists as well as performers start to disappear in the kind of societies or the people that they are interested in, the whole issues start to become kind of dangerous in the sense that when the script of the artist and the text of everyday life start to sort of blur too much, then there's some kind of problem. And the same is for anthropologists. When anthropologists start to go native, then that's start to become a problem. And to me, the camera, the film process, was really an important way to set up a kind of, again, a choreographic space, a kind of line between the observer and the observed, and also a catalyst with a kind of through which a new process of negotiation could be set up. So to me, film process, especially participatory film, which is a film, we'll talk about Jean Rouch, a film that really set up, is not a film that is set up to capture reality, but to provoke a new kind of reality. And Jean Rouch was really interesting filmmaker and anthropologist because unlike many anthropologists, he didn't believe in cultures. He didn't believe that culture were fixed entities. He believed in culture that were in ongoing transformation. So he used the camera not to capture or freeze any particular reality, but to provoke and to restage reality. So his film is performative precisely because he believes that all cultures are performative. We are kind of staging and restaging our reality every day. I guess we can.
This one?
Before I show you, we show you a clip of Jean-Rouch Le Maître Fou. I just briefly give you a background to the film. The film was shot in 1954, and it's basically about the Auca cult, which was a cult that was persecuted by the British and French colonial administration because it was staging kind of very violent rituals, were using taboo and slaughtering taboo animals, and were also anti-colonial rituals. So they were political rituals, not only religious rituals. At the time when the film was made, the kind of forced industrialization from the colonies was kind of really changing the economy of Africa. And so the film is an expose of colonialism. But as you will see, it's an expose that is made through the language of the Auca cult and also through this kind of sensuous and invisible knowledge, religious magic knowledge, rather than as a kind of rational expose of the colonial system.
Yeah. The cult is called the Hauka,
H-A-U-K-A.
And was the Hauka cult not formed in the
1920s,
actually?
Yes.
That's when this cult...
Yes.
And Les Maîtres Fous translates as the Mad Masters, which is the title of the film.
Sorry, I'm going to show you the second day of the film. The film is about 3 days in the life of these migrant workers. In the first day, they are shot as normal people in the market, in the town market. And this is the second day where they start to they go out in the town, they gather at the periphery of the city, and they start this ritual. So this is the second day, and the people you see are the crazy masters.
In Niger?
Yes, in Accra, which is in Niger, yeah.
Slow march, the parade march of the British Army.
Let's go there.
And the train starts slowly in the left foot, then in the right foot. It travels upward through the hands, arms, shoulders, up to the head. And the first man Cosette gets up. He is Capragati, the corporal of the guard. He salutes everyone.
We can talk a little bit more about this film. It's interesting that this film was really inspirational for many, both contemporary artists like Steve McQueen, but also documentary filmmakers like Molly Denis, Nick Broomfield. The idea of this camera as a kind of catalyst for provoking social change and kind of as a tool of political negotiation. There are many issues about this film. For instance, it was inspired by surrealist theater and this idea of this kind of human personality, this kind of always in between craziness and normality. You know, the whole film really is about, is it staged or is it really real? Are they performing a ritual? Do they have a script or they're unconscious? There is all this issue also relationship between the filmmakers. Miranda was saying the trance was literally provoked by the filmmaker. So it was not that the filmmaker was filming a trance. So there's all this issue of the politics really of the film process. And this other clip is an interesting example of filming violence in Brazil from a very, very poetic perspective. And also, again, this relationship between actions and the context. So I'll just show you a little bit, and then we can discuss about it later. The filmmaker is called Guimarães, Cao Guimarães, and the film is called From the Window of My Room.
And what year was it?
2004.
Oh, is he just trying to stop it?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's lots to say and lots of questions about both of those films. That last one's just incredible dynamic of I find it incredibly tender, and this relationship between the two. I assume it's a brother and sister, and it's just so not what you expect of this play fighting in a favela in Brazil, and the fact that it's raining, the fact that it's muddy, and yet actually it's very beautiful. It's very sensual, isn't it? The whole feeling of it, and it's so soft. The way they're falling in the mud, and then the way they're playing with each other. Very, it's kind of got an abandon to it, but there's a sort of, it's very safe. And then at this moment he takes this branch and sort of acts as though he's sort of whipping it, but it's like a tickling with a branch. And then this final reveal as they run off, and you just get a glimpse of the kind of context of the environment which this is happening in.
I'm Brazilian. Actually, they're my friends. I find it very uncomfortable watching this. Being abroad, and as usual, you just get Brazil, the bloody violence, and Africa, you get possession, and I really, it also upsets me this. And we're showing an arts context, anthropology. You go to Brazil, you go and live in favela, and we're in the northern hemisphere showing videos of the southern hemisphere. I do not know. There is this feeling of observing and I don't know.
Can I?
Maybe we should back out the faces of the children that we do on our TV.
No, it's not about that.
Can I think I mean, this is a concern that we anthropologists take very seriously. This film was shown by Cao Guimarães at it won the São Paulo Film Festival. And when he thanked the audience, he said, I thank these two children that I don't even know their name. And the point of Cao is that he's really, he doesn't believe in anthropology. He doesn't believe in documentary. He was just showing that he was an observer, and that this was an event that didn't represent at all Brazil. It was a kind of a performance that happened in a kind of specific time and space. It was not a symbol of Brazil. He emphasized the difference very often with, for instance, the difference in sound. You can hear the rain outside, and you can hear the rain on the windowsill. He really keeps on emphasizing the distance of the event. So I think he's actually an anti-anthropologist. And the reason why I like Cao, who is also a kind of a friend, is that really he kind of doesn't believe in anthropology. He doesn't believe in doing this kind of long-term participation. He really wanted to emphasize the distance between the observer and the action. And in fact, he pulls down the camera as they run away. And I think this film is political because of that. I think it tells you that there's no possibility of actually doing anthropology. And I feel uncomfortable being an anthropologist. In fact, I actually, my anthropology is always in urban context, in places where actually subjects are not that vulnerable. I mean, I had to negotiate my presence quite substantially.
I think also you presented this because you're interested in violence, and these two films are kind of somehow. That's part of the subject, but actually, I don't think we're witnessing violence in the film. I don't know. I'm witnessing a relationship and a kind of play.
I want to yes.
I'm also and I think I did feel in the beginning a bit uncomfortable about it. But the way the film develops, in a way, it's very,
the first thing I thought was, oh my God, this is one of these films that we just watch on the news of something horrible that's going to happen. And actually, because of the way it just keeps on, he has really long shots and quite interesting and nice. And it's just, okay, it's a play. It's a dance.
I think it's interesting also to note that the film before, the Jean Rouch film, was when at its premiere was dismissed by all sides, well, more than dismissed. It was thought of as disgusting, both by it was banned by the British, but also it was very controversial, wasn't it? Because some African students living in Paris who saw the film felt that it was presenting an image of Africans to a European audience that confirmed a certain stereotype about irrationality. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
So it was, and it's it's definitely disturbing film.
This film also got a prize somewhere very early on.
Which one?
The Jean Rouch.
Yes, he won the prize at Venice Film Festival. Yes. I mean, it was an incredible film because he used the Auca pagan iconography, he used the Auca language, the icon choreography. Yeah, so it's really a kind of it's much more indigenous than it looks like. I mean, he puts this commentary which doesn't have nearly any meaning. The commentary he is improvising the commentary, and it's really ironical. That what matters is really the process of crafting together this film, and also he had this idea of showing the film on local television as really a piece of activism, basically. So he was showing this film that became incredibly controversial against the colonial system. But to going back to the favela, I think that's it's really important to think. I mean, the films are very political, obviously, and what Kao was reacting also against was the idea of all this kind of glamour favela genre that came out from City of God and Padilla, Jose Padilla. So I mean, film really do express this problem. How do you represent the favela? And maybe he was kind of telling you that there's no possibility of representing. The only thing that you can say is to frame on a specific performance in a specific moment in time. And that, I think, is more a declaration of impossibility of representing something rather than a kind of a statement of this is poverty, this is favela. Yeah.
I just wanted to talk about the previous film.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting to me. The filmmaker considered that his presence and his camera's role was the instigator for the action. And that lies into a lot of quite recent post-film ideas, revisionist ideas, particularly around photographic practice, where there's a discussion of people playing to archetypes, i.e. the subjects of the photographs playing to archetypes, because they actually had the knowledge of the archetype. And I'm thinking of, I don't know if you're familiar with Otto Benga, and it was popularised on Channel 4, to I think it was California State Fair. Live human beings were living there for 3-4 months at a time. Photography was implicated because people could hire and one cameras and photograph the Congolese peoples who were living there. And they could photograph what they thought were traditions and constructs. But within that, there's evidence that the men and women from Africa were playing at the time. And there was a financial exchange there as well, which made it different to seeing what if the financial arrangements were real or not. It's just an interesting kind of comparison.
Well, this is, I think, a very interesting discussion, because I think that Rouch was an initiator of that movement, because he really was, his agenda was a kind of surrealist agenda. So he didn't believe in types, actually. He didn't believe in culture, he didn't believe in archetypes, he didn't believe in any types. He believed in kind of fluidity of human beings and cultures. And so his agenda was, well, these people might as well play and perform because that's human nature. So I think he initiated this kind of postmodern, if you want, manifesto. That was very good for anthropologists to get used with the fact that actually cultures, you can't really box culture in specific categories, that you have to deal with fluid transformation, you have to deal with people who actually are never indigenous, are always different and up to date. So I think that Rouge was a good way of criticizing anthropology, but I don't think that to go too far with this game of playing the primitive, it's good, because then we had lots of kind of bad experiments. For instance, I mean, I don't want to talk about any specific artist now, but there is a lot of this idea of let's stage with the primitive a kind of different reality. And I think especially when you are an anthropologist who is socially engaged, then you have to try to actually understand that some realities are actually there. And then you have to try to have a kind of more, if you want, essentialistic attitude or documentaristic attitude. There is something that is worthwhile to look for. So I think it's I don't particularly buy into this new idea of performing the primitive or deconstructing totally differences. I think that there is still a role for some kind of engaged anthropology or engage representation, if you want. I don't know.
I agree with you, but I think there's some ambivalence which calls into question the evidence that's being presented.
This evidence here, Rouge. Yes, the film is quite ambivalent. The politics of the film is less ambivalent because that was a film made with outcome. So one of the things that actually as an anthropologist you learn to do is to think about way of distributing the thing you make, the way actually if you make any money, that money goes to the people who have been helping you or been participating, involving them in producing, in editing. I mean, there's a lot of issue about real participatory film, how you do that. And there are kind of ways, for instance, the film that I made in Sheffield was very, I paid lots of attention in kind of editing with other people, in showing the thing, in kind of discussing the film with them. So I think that there are ways in which you can make the process democratic, really.
Just ask you, you present today as a kind of dialogue, so obviously filmmaker and anthropologist, and it's a kind of curious thing. You share and borrow each other's sort of words and terminology from each other's fields, and it seems like you can have a shared conversation. But of course, I wonder about the translation that goes on between these two languages.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking at films and feeling worried about the extent to which we can understand and comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
I personally prefer that film because it's so open, there's no narrative, no interpretation of what I was looking at.
Mm-hmm.
It was left up to me completely to sort of compare to this material. I quite like that, and I don't mind that sort of comprehension. But it does seem to me there's a huge problem about two worlds with two different languages and vocabularies and conceptual frameworks. I mean, how enough we talk to each other really, apart from the fact that we can use shared terminology. This is what comes up, isn't it? How we interpret what we look at.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I sort of feel like I can pick up on lots of things that Mao was talking about. For example, I was just thinking about the thing of fixing, the attempt, the desire to fix cultures, to see them as fixed, and especially filmmakers. And think about dance and the desire to fix a dance, to translate it into film, inevitably often means misrecognizing the nature of dance and seeing it as a stable visual object which then you can capture. And often choreographers also misrecognize the nature of film as well, and how do you, but yet as an artist, for example, and as an anthropologist, your job is to fix something, to present something. So how do you do that when often when you're trying to capture living cultures or living dancers? To me, some of the problems maybe are the same. I don't know whether I'm being a bit literal about it, but I think there is something about dance that's rather, you have to first decide what the dance was doing, what the context of a gesture is. All these questions are rather complicated before you decide what's an appropriate way to represent it in film. And you know, I think there are some parallels. So I was just jumped in with the thing that I wanted to say, but I'm sort of saying there are different worlds, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, what are the world that you were discussing? I mean, because we are obviously dealing with three universes: film, performance, and anthropology. Are you talking about the relationship between anthropology and performance? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The commentary is so kind of definitive about what's happening in what
Mm-hmm.
and that was kind of felt so dated
Mm-hmm.
and very alien, and it's sort of that throughout the thought for me.
Mm-hmm.
Actually,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
And, why can't we just
But I think it's also important to say that Rush also has been very inventive with his soundtracks, hasn't he? He's also had narrations from people in the film commenting. He gets bringing them into the edit suite. He's also played with fiction within documentary. It's true that it's almost redundant. He's saying, this person is now the general's wife. This is the general's hat. It's very, it's like in a Bresson film. It's this kind. Well, actually, that's bad.
it would be good if you could show it to some people without the commentary in their scene.
I watched it for the first time. I've got a box of Onion French, and my French is really poor. And I really enjoyed it though, just because the commentary was like music rather than.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Paying attention, and I really enjoyed it. But why this kind of commentary really annoyed me.
Yes.
Yeah, I was
Yes.
wondering why he's speaking in English.
Oh, so this is really horrible.
Well, that's the English version, but it is true. I mean, also the commentary was improvised because it was made really quickly. I mean, he kind of followed the images and apparently he didn't even plan it. In fact, it's redundant, the commentary. I mean, it's not necessary. It's just describing something that is happening there.
But don't you think he's addressing a European audience 2 years before independence, before this was a so presumably there was a purpose to him. He's addressing an audience and saying this.
But also, it was a tradition of documentary filmmaking in the 50s and 60s.
Exactly. Well, yes. I mean, it's also. Yes, I mean, there's also. I think, I mean, that I wanted to also go to the relationship between dance and anthropology, which I think is also important. But I think the film was also a way of actually incorporating into the very film some idea of politics that Rouge had. So the idea of performativity, the idea of a film without authority, which was really the same thing that was happening on screen. The Auca cult is a cult where the leader is a performer, and so he wanted to actually incorporate in the very filmmaking process some political ideas. So the commentary is really a way of nearly kind of keeping you distant from the real issues. The real issues are really in the structure of the film, and I think this is such an incredibly complex film in the way it really reproduces the philosophy of the Auca, the politics of the Auca within the very film structure. So I think it's really a film that you have to watch many times to understand that he wanted to. Actually, it's a transcultural cinema. What he wanted to do is it was not communicating any rational message. He wanted really for the message to be subliminal and to be communicated through the film structure. The reason why I like it is precisely because of this, not so much for the ethnographic content, but because it's one of the first films that actually talks about incorporated politics into the structure of the film, and that's why it inspired artists like Steve McQueen or contemporary artists who really play with the politics of the images, the kind of incorporated politics in the formal structure of the film. In terms of discussion between dance and anthropology, I think that there's an interesting definition of Rosie Lee Goldberg about performance. Performance is something that actually some artists started to do because they wanted to be present in society. They wanted to push the boundaries of conventional art, and I think that the performance does that really well, and in a way it's got some kind of anarchic idea, which is really the idea of getting rid of frames and the kind of thinking about self-organization, about open structures. And I think that that's the same aim of anthropologists in a way, to look for these forms of human organization that kind of maximize social creativity, cooperation, reciprocity. So I think that both have some kind of utopian aim, and that in a way they're kind of also kind of quite contradictory, because the ideal world of anthropology is a world without cultures, and I think the ideal world of choreographer is probably a world without choreography, without what kind of movements are open. So I think that there are some similarity, at least in the choreography and the performance that inspires me.
I'd like to propose perhaps the work of the anthropologist, not as somebody who has to travel miles and miles and hours, but perhaps somebody who can look at just maybe a go to somewhere near London and look at violence and study violence here from an anthropological perspective. I've studied with Massimiliano, and she basically from Argentina went away to America to study, but she had to go back and actually learn anthropology. PhD was on Cambridge. She hated
Fantastic PhD, yeah.
But she had to go to residencies, hours and hours
Yeah.
and died. And she was not indigenous, but she was in some way, because she had to be wearing the hat of the objective anthropologist, and therefore her book talks about politics, talks about economy, and it's very interesting.
Beautiful.
Later on, studying with Drew Williams, she proposed this idea of personal anthropology, which of course is, she didn't invent it, somebody else did, but I forgot the name, because personal anthropology. But the idea of you can't be really objective if you are looking at something and then you bring your own experience and background into what you're looking and your expectation. And I wonder how you can actually make anthropology from the point of view of the filmmaker, because not only you are distancing yourself, not always supposed to be somehow not studying, not analyzing, not testing, but something like that. So how can you actually embed yourself within a culture and really sharing that and make a conclusion at the end within the framework that you decide to use by the use of the camera that you said somehow put something in between. Or is that a filter, or how is your approach?
I guess you're always within a culture anyway, aren't? I mean, you start. Huh?
You observe something, and you say what it was, and kind of the conclusion of what might be.
Well, I think there are two kind of separate issues here. The first is the one that of actually looking at your culture, and when I did my PhD at the London School of Economics, and I said I wanted to go to Sheffield, my supervisor was desperate. I said, "Are you crazy? That in the history of the LSE, nobody has ever done a field work that was not in some kind of tribal society." And in fact, I had many problems to get a supervisor. But then it worked really well because you know, I agree with you. It's a time in which actually no anthropologist have ever done a study of our own violence, of our own poverty, of our own kind of alienation, our own culture. So I did that, and it worked really well. But then, you know, we live in an era in which even the definition of our culture is problematic, in the sense that you know, that if you study London, you're not studying our culture. You're studying something more complex than that. And so I guess you have to really keep up with the complexity and fluidity of what's happening. And I think that new ways of maybe doing comparative fieldworks in which you actually set up team of researcher, you have friends around who are interested in the same thing, but you know, the idea of the anthropologist is really old-fashioned and is changing. So that's one thing. I mean, for instance, my research in Brazil was on steel, because in Sheffield I was looking at the steel industry, you know, this kind of the post-steel industry, and when I went to Brazil, I look at similar things. So I'm interested in this kind of broad comparison. Because I don't believe that you can talk about culture specific. I don't believe that we have our own culture. I think the culture really, really always in the process of exchange and transformation. But in terms of the camera, I agree with you that it would be very difficult to show up in a place with a camera and to be an anthropologist, you know, to have a successful fieldwork. But I also think at some point, for instance in my case, after 1.5 years that I stayed there in Sheffield, there was a difficulty for me to talk about my research and to negotiate my research in academic terms. I mean, I was going to go back and everybody was telling me, if you're leaving this factory, you're actually being really unemployed. How do you think you make money out of writing a book about us? You know, you really, they were worried about my future as an academic, because there was no way that actually they could understand that my research was somehow meaningful. And so for me, the camera was really a way to go back to a kind of an elementary language for me, you know, and through which I could really rethink and renegotiate my research. So I think that is both. And I was much more happy to make a film than to write a monograph that I don't think many people have read anyway. And that film is keep on being screened and discussed, and so that I think that's very important. Sorry? No.
Also, where are you from? Because you're just, I don't know where you're from, but for you, going to Sheffield isn't your local.
No, exactly. No, I'm from Italy, so yeah. It was a huge.
Exotic.
It was very exotic. I mean, yes. I mean, when I came to Britain, for me, Sheffield was the most exotic place in the world. I mean, and I mean, not exotic in a bad way. I really wanted to, you know, there was this kind of feeling when I went to Sheffield, total transformation, a total change, a total kind of really an era that was closing down, you know, and the landscape was incredibly dramatic, and so I felt that was very exciting for me. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Just interested your film The Army. Would you talk in kind of a practical way the relationship of going into that community
Yes.
with anthropology and then making a film? Just kind of in a practical sense.
Yes. I mean, maybe in my imagination I rather stretch the terms of anthropology, but maybe not. But I do a certain amount of field work, which is research, which is getting to know people and building relationships, and as I said before, learning the language. So it's a big, a lot of time. I wanted to make a film with a regiment of soldiers and a military band, so I had to invest quite a lot of time in getting to know them, getting them to trust me, and getting permission. And in order to do that, took quite a long time because I had literally learning the language so that I could impress them that I was serious about what I was doing, that I took their culture seriously. I mean, I was mainly talking about the drill and the movements, but obviously if you go in saying, oh, I like it when you do that thing like that, so I tried to take seriously, watch their training and how they learnt how to do it, and so that's a big part of the work. And I did have ideas about transforming what they were doing. That the sort of choreographer in me thought, could you just reverse that movement or whatever? But of course, no, that's not really. And and quite right. But what they did allow me to do was move where they did what they did. So I wanted to film them out in the open, not on the parade ground. So I deprived them of their audience. Normally these displays are made for an audience, and I did it in what looked like in the middle of Salisbury Plain, so it looked as though they were just doing it for the birds and the insects. That was my idea, which takes some of the idea of context and causality out of it a little bit, I thought. And tried to include sort of points of views from within the trees and the bushes to emphasise that. And that was the main thing. The other thing I did was I didn't include any of the sound of the... I apologise if you haven't seen the film, but I think for people who are at the place, there's a DVD there and at Laban. I took out the commands that are shouted. So they do things in unison all of a sudden, but it's because it's been shouted. But I took that part out, and I didn't film any of the people giving the command, which again is I'm taking out the cause of what causes them to do it. So that emphasises, I don't know what it emphasises, a certain strangeness about what they're doing, because, or maybe the mechanicalness of what they're doing. And I think that's my main interventions, really. Apart from that, I just chose things that they did, and so I'm taking things a little bit out of context that they do and saying this bit of the training over there and that bit over there. That's mainly the.
What was their reaction when they watched the film?
Well, it was very, very formal. I mean, it was very frightening because we went for a special screening and all the heads of the light division, the I don't know what they're called, drill masters or whatever, and they all sat in front. All of the men were in this big hall. They all had to stand to attention until they were told to relax, and they all went like that. And I did a little talk about, poetic documentary or something. and I mean, actually, I always do that. I always try and explain before and afterwards, this is not a journalistic exercise. I'm not there to expose. I'm not doing that kind of thing where I'm going to catch, but it's also personal. I'm bringing so I did a little bit of just trying to get them to expect the unexpected, and that I've taken certain liberties in... how did they... well, the soldiers all giggled because they saw each other. It was actually fine. It was actually fine. I mean, I find that a lot of things that I do have quite a lot of ambiguity in them. I'm not coming out... there isn't an announcement that war is bad in the film anywhere. I mean, it's quite. Most people who see it find it absurd. It's absurd. That's what it is. But that's nothing you can really name. So I find that people in general, and those people which I was very worried about, they didn't mind. They were just worried that the drill was right. Yeah. And there was one bit where they sort of do a mistake. But that's really how they don't want to be misrepresented in that way. And generally, I didn't misrepresent them. And actually, I think it was fine. I mean, it was a interesting whole negotiation. I also found out that film crews operate very similarly to the army. It's very hierarchical. It's very structured. And in a way, we got on frighteningly well. And I was the director. I quite liked it, and there was I was talking to my equivalent, and so it was sort of quite interesting. Yeah, very interesting. I think it probably really is time, isn't it? Because it's 8:30. So unless there's something we haven't. Well, we've covered like 3 entire disciplines, yes. Which is rather a lot. But I hope some of it resonates.
Sorry, you mentioned a couple of performance artists that you admire. Before Francis Alice, you said another 2 quite quickly and I didn't catch them.
Yvonne Rainer, Martha Rosler.
I was going to ask, we have a list of the films that were shown, and I thought we would put that on the Crossing Borders webpage, and then it'll be there. And I wondered if we could just jot down those other references.
Yeah.
And it feels through another couple that came up as well. We could take those down.
On the list, I've included the Singing Street, which is a film that was on as you came in, which is a lovely film that's part of the Free Cinema DVD, which was a documentary movement in the 50s, around then, 50s and 60s, I think 50s, British, which is children's songs and games, street games. And there's also Andrew Cotting's Gallivant, which we didn't have time for, but he does very interesting play on folklore, on performance in his film Clippity Clop, and he's very interesting in terms of being very fluid, playful, and telling lies about folklore as well. I highly recommend it, but it's on there if you want to check it out.
We will put that up on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.